Praise the Lord Jesus. Thank you so much for joining us. We all on board? Thank you. Turn with me, please, to the book of Joel, chapter 2. Joel, chapter 2 is still in chapter 2, heading rapidly to chapter 3, hopefully. When we get to Joel, chapter 2, verse 15, we read the following. Blow a trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, proclaim a solemn assembly. Gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children, the nursing infants. Let the bridegroom come out of his room and the bride out of her chamber. And then it calls for the clergy to repent and makes reference to the house of the Lord. Verse 15 simply reiterates or echoes what is in verse 1 of chapter 2. Now, when you see that happen, that tells us something very important. When you see the introductory verse, blow a trumpet in Zion, and it's hortatory, it's commanding, okay? And you see the same verse repeated later in the same, we can't say chapters that were not in the original, but in the same text, in the same pericope, okay? You have an inclusio, like, not that it's parenthetical, but it's bookends. It tells you that everything between those two passages in the primary meaning refers to the same thing. Now, we can look at things that happen here that were for Joel's time. We can look at things that have a partial fulfillment in the first coming of Christ. But the overall meaning of everything between verse 1 of chapter 2 and verse 15 of chapter 2, and what immediately follows it, must primarily be about the same thing. Must primarily be about the same thing, okay? Well, let's begin looking at this. We talked about the armies, what they could be, what they can't be. That was last week. If you were not with us last week, I'd have to point you back to listen to the video on Moriel TV or on RTN. But look at verse 10. Before them the earth quakes, the heavens tremble, the sun and moon grow dark, the stars lose their brightness. The Lord utters his voice before his army. Surely his camp is very great. For strong is he who carries out his word. The day of the Lord is indeed great and very awesome. Who can endure it? Now notice chapter 2 begins the same way, bearing in mind there were no chapter divisions in the original Hebrew canon. Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountains. Let the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. And it begins to say the same kind of things about darkness and invasion and so forth, and destruction. That tells you that both are referring to the same thing. Whatever partial fulfillment it may or may not have historically, be it Nebuchadnezzar's invasions, be it possibly a Gog and Magog scenario, other than the final one at the end of the millennium, is another Gog and Magog that prefigures the ultimate one in Revelation from the book of Ezekiel. Whatever that may mean, the ultimate meaning must be primarily about the day of the Lord when an army comes in. Now notice, when this happens, you've got the quake. The heavens tremble, the sun and moon grow dark, the stars lose their brightness. Look with me, please, if you will, to Matthew chapter 24, verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. He will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Then it goes on, learn the parable of the fig tree, etc. Okay. This has been argued by pre-tribulation people to mean, in their way of thinking, that's something about the Jews and about the tribulation saints. It's not about the rapture. This was a view invented by Darby and the people who influenced Darby in the 19th century. It was not the belief of the early church. Neither was it the belief of Charles Spurgeon. Neither was it the belief of A.W. Tozer. Neither was it the belief of Corrie ten Boom. Neither was it the belief of Dr. Walter Martin. Okay. Neither was it the belief of David Pawson. And certainly neither is it my belief. Okay. It is a nonsense that many sincere people have bought into. It is after the Great Tribulation, the megathalipson, that the angels are sent for the harvest. We have two harvests in Revelation. The first one is the gathering of the elect. It happens after the tribulation. Again, as most of you know, the second license that pre-tribulational thought has given itself without any exegetical warrant, they just invented it, is to say the tribulation and the day of the Lord, the day of his wrath, and so forth, are all the same thing, that they are synonymous. They are absolutely not synonymous. As we pointed out many times, they are very different words in the Greek language. Very different. Wrath is orge. We believers, at least not the true church, are not appointed unto orge. They're not appointed unto wrath. Tribulation is something different. The tribulation is not the total 7 years. This is a nonsense. It's a nonsense. It begins with the beginning of birth pangs. Then you go into a greater tribulation. Up till now, it is Satan persecuting the people of God through the person of Antichrist. Once the rapture happens, now it's the wrath of God in the day of the Lord. Tribulation comes from Satan via Antichrist. Wrath comes from God. Okay? Wrath comes from God. Okay. It ends sometime, probably shortly, after the midway point of the 7 years of the 70th week of Daniel. It takes place after the midway point, probably not long after, but certainly at some time after. Okay. I cannot speculate as to how soon after, but it's definitely after the midway point when the Antichrist is identified in one of two ways. One is obviously the mark of the beast, but the other way he's identified is with what Jesus said, the abomination of desolation, Hashikutz Meshomem, being set up in the temple. And Paul says the same thing in 2 Thessalonians. Our pre-tribulational brethren cannot take these things on face value and literal meaning. they have to extrapolate all kinds of theories that are never believed by the early church and that were rejected by so many major luminaries of the church. I've only named some of them. Dr. Samuel Tregales was another. Corey ten Boom was another. David Paulson was another. Charles Spurgeon was another. Dr. Walter Martin was another. A.W. Tozer was another. None of these people believed this stuff that's popularly peddled. None of it. Now let's go further with this. Immediately after it gets dark, the Lord comes and they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds, okay, with power and great glory after his sign appears. Okay. Now, that must be the same as you see in Joel. It gets dark. With the day of the Lord, it gets dark. It's a day of darkness and gloom, it gets dark. And you have signs in the cosmos. The sun and moon grow dark. The stars lose their brightness. These things have spiritual meanings. What is the spiritual meaning? The sun, S-U-N, as most of you know, the rising of the sun, is a metaphor for the rising of Christ, the S-O-N. Isaiah, arise and shine, for your light has come. The glory of the risen Lord is brighter than the sun. All four gospels say he rose at sunrise. Okay, the rising of the sun. The moon has no light of its own. It can only reflect the light of the sun. When Jesus came, there was the great light and the small light. The small light being John the Baptist, the great light being Jesus. By this time, something happens. It gets so dark that the ministry, that the light of Christ is not being reflected. Antichrist has his paramount apex. The faithful church is removed. Now God deals with Antichrist and his kingdom and intervenes on behalf of Israel and the Jews. Let's look now at Joel. It gets dark. It's the same thing. Now notice in Matthew 24, it says there's an earthquake. Remember when Jesus rose from the dead, what happened? There was an earthquake, wasn't there? These increase in birth and earthquakes parallel the increase in birth pangs. The reason you see earthquakes increasing in number is because it reflects the coming resurrection. The earth will be like a woman in labor. You understand? The maternal contractions become more frequent before the man-child comes in Revelation 12. Well, that is the obstetric illustration. The seismological illustration is the earthquakes. The big earthquake finally comes, just like in California, Japan, stuff shakes. But then, bang, sooner or later, there's a big eruption on the San Andreas Fault. Earthquakes increase. There are signs that the resurrection is getting nearer, much the same as maternal contractions indicate the time of the baby's birth is getting nearer. We have to understand. I know a lot of you know this stuff, but we have new people joining us, so I have to explain it for the sake of the newer people. Okay. This earthquake idea, once that happens, it gets dark after the resurrection. He sends his angels in Matthew 24, and he gathers his elect. Okay. With this great trumpet, I'm not going into the trumpet now. We have a teaching on the silver trumpets. But notice it's got to be the same. It's got to be the same. Now, what we see also is they'll see the Son of Man coming. Okay. Up to the last moment in Joel, God is pleading with people to repent. This pleading applies both to the apostate church and to Israel and the Jews. Up to the last moment. Then again, God says, blow the trumpet. So, this army comes, and God, as we looked at last week, destroys it in verse 20 of Joel chapter 2. It's done great things, but God destroys it. He stomps on these locusts. Whatever happened with Joel and the locusts happens again with the demon cohorts of Antichrist in Revelation chapter 9, as we saw in our first lesson from Joel. But then something happens. Verse 28. It will come about after this. I'll pour out my spirit on all mankind. On your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men see visions. And even on my male and female servants, I will pour out my spirit in those days. Now, the term mankind has to do with basar, flesh in Hebrew. We cannot say it is limited to the Jews, although it has a very specific meaning for the Jews. Right after that, in verse 30, I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, columns of smoke. Once again, the sun will be turned into darkness, the moon into blood. It may cosmologically be a red moon phase or something like this, but it means persecution of the church. The church only reflects the light of the sun. The cosmic phenomena reflect spiritual things. The stars don't give their light. Abraham's descendants are like the stars of heaven. There'll be no light. It'll just be total darkness before Christ comes. And it will come about, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be delivered. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, there will be those who escape. And the Lord said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls. Now, many people, with good reason, believe that that escape is an escape to Petra for the Jews in Jerusalem. I only mention that in passing. They have a good point. They raise a good possibility. I don't disagree with them. But let's look now. Turn with me to the book of Acts chapter 2. Peter's kerygma. But Peter, taking his stand in verse 14 with the 11, raised his voice and declared to them, Men of Judea and all you who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and give heed to your words. Notice that Joel and Peter both speak about geographical Jerusalem. Spiritual implications of it? Yes. But it is speaking geographically. This is what was spoken. He makes an analogy. We might translate it or understand it as this is like that. It shall be in the last days, God says, I will pour forth my spirit on all mankind. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men see visions, your old men dream dreams. Even among my bondservants, both men and women, I will in those days pour forth my spirit. They shall prophesy. I will grant wonders in the sky above and signs on the earth beneath. Blood, fire, vapor, smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness, just like Joel, just like Matthew 24 and the Olivet Discourse. Okay. The moon into blood before the great and glorious day of the Lord shall come. Remember, the day of the Lord is when God pours out his judgment on the kingdom of Antichrist and intervenes to save what's left of Israel. But the timing, it doesn't happen until the removal. It says these signs cosmologically will happen. But it is after these things. Same as Matthew 24. Men of Israel, listen. Then he goes on and he gives the first gospel sermon, the first evangelistic sermon. Was there blood and fire and smoke? No. Was there celestial signs in the cosmos? No. Was the sun darkened? No. Did the moon stop giving its light? No. No. None of that happened. Therefore, whatever happened on the day of Pentecost can only be a partial fulfillment of what Joel said. This is consistent with biblical prophecy about the first coming and the second. Again, most of you know this. In Zechariah chapter 12, they will look upon me who they have pierced, and mourn as one mourns for an only son. In John 19, it quotes Zechariah 12:10, but only half the verse. They'll look upon me who they have pierced. They don't mourn for him then. They're yelling, crucify him. Okay. A partial fulfillment. A partial fulfillment. Most of you know when Jesus read the Torah scroll in Nazareth, he read half the verse from Isaiah 61. He didn't read the second half about the vengeful day of the Lord. He only read about the year of Jubilee, the favorable year. The vengeance is in his second coming. Grace is in his first. A partial fulfillment with the ultimate fulfillment still to come. This is a consistent pattern. These things are separated by the age of the church. that overlaps, but is not the same as, but largely overlaps with the time of the Gentiles. It refers to the period between the 69th and 70th week of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9. That's when this happens. The partial fulfillment is between the 67th and the 69th week. The total fulfillment is in the 70th week. You've got this hiatus, the age of the church, in the middle. Now, on Pentecost, it was the Hebrew feast, obviously, of weeks, Hag Shavuot. The church had only existed embryonically until now. Now it's born. But it's exclusively Jewish. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. His Spirit was poured out on all flesh, in a sense. How can this happen when his Spirit is poured out on all flesh again? Well, let's look at Zechariah 12:10. I'll pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication, so they'll look upon me who they have pierced. Like Pentecost, it has a specific meaning for the Jews. It's poured out on them first, but it is not limited to them. Look with me to Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. Behold, he's coming with the clouds. Every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. Even so, amen. All the tribes of the earth. Something specific for Israel? Yes. Limited to Israel? Exclusive to Israel? No. Pentecost was the beginning of the church, which was predominantly Gentile. But it's only a partial fulfillment of what Joel said. All of that cosmological phenomena didn't happen. It still has to. What I'm saying is, the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, beginning in verse 29, Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, and Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, are all the coming fulfillment of Joel chapter 2, verse 28, 29. Partial fulfillment in his first coming, total fulfillment in his second. What we see in Joel, in Zechariah, Matthew, and Revelation all describe it. Now let's just for a moment go back to Matthew 24, please. Verse 31, he'll send his angels with a great trumpet and gather his elect from the four winds. Remember, Jesus told the parable of the wheat and tares. And the close of the age is when the angels harvest the elect. The rapture is compared to a harvest. In Mark chapter 4, we are told when the crop permits, he sends the harvesters. There are two harvests. The first is the rapture. But turn with me, please, to Revelation chapter 14. Verse 14. I looked and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, because the hour has come. The hour to reap has arrived, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. That's the first. He who sat on the cloud swung the sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now, obviously, this is talking about a temple in heaven, of which the earthly one is a reflection, as it says in Hebrews. But now, verse 17, another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. And another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar and called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, put in your sharp sickle, gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. And the angel swung the sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. Well, that's quite a distance. This is obviously making a reference to what Joel speaks about in the valley of decision, the valley of Jehoshaphat. Jehovah shall judge. Okay. The armies of Antichrist gather under Armageddon in what we call Armageddon, in the plain of Jezreel. This army from the north comes from Jezreel in the north. And the Antichrist's last stand, Satan's last desperate effort. And he comes at Jerusalem. If you're familiar with the geography of even modern Jerusalem, think of the Mount of Olives with its cleft on the east side of the Kidron Valley. Think of the Temple Mount on the west side. Okay. Just to the north of the Mount of Olives, which is separated from Jerusalem by the Kidron Valley, is an orifice valley, a large one, underneath what's known as Har Tzofim, Mount Scopus, the location of Hebrew University today. I'm saying this for those who've been to Jerusalem and know the terrain. This is very near to this neighborhood that's causing, in fact, this neighborhood that's causing the riots in the Al-Aqsa Mosque is there. It goes down like this, extending from roughly where the Rockefeller Museum is today up to Hebrew University. you have a widening on the northern axis of the Kidron Valley. Essentially, this valley of Jehoshaphat, okay, is the northern orifice widening of the Kidron Valley. With the Temple Mount, the Mount of Olives, and Mount Scopus come together with this valley in it. Okay. These things will literally transpire at this location. Look with me, please, once again to the book of Joel, then we'll go to Zechariah. This army that gets destroyed. Okay. They get destroyed outside the city in Revelation, but all of these locusts come, and there is the conflict. Okay. Now look at chapter 3, verse 1. For behold, in those days, at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, Jesus is going to reign from Jerusalem on the throne of David. He will restore the fortunes of Judah to the believing Jews. But I will gather the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Remember Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat, Jehovah shall judge. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people, my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they've divided up my land. They've also cast lots for my people. Now that echoes what they did to Jesus. Okay. Traded a boy for a harlot. Symbolically, they rejected the promised son in favor of the wicked woman. But I only mentioned that in passing. And sold a girl for wine that they may drink. Now let's look. This is the valley of Jehoshaphat. In Revelation 16, we see the armies of Antichrist are gathered in the north, in the valley of Jezreel. The valley of Jezreel separates Samaria from Galilee. It separates Samaria from Galilee. And when this happens, all kinds of phenomena happen. But in verse 16, they gathered them together in the place which in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Armageddon. That's where they gather in Revelation 16. Notice it does not specify there's a battle there. It does not specify that. Where do they go from there? Well, they go to the great city. This brings us to the issue of Babylon. I've tried to explain this in my books. You had literal Babylon, the capital of the Babylonian Empire, and the place where the Tower of Babel had been in Genesis. With the later invasions by Persia of Babylon, as predicted by Daniel. As predicted by Isaiah and Daniel. The 300 priests of Babylon, there were 300 of them, relocated westward to Pergamum. That is a historical fact. Jesus refers to Pergamum as the place of Satan's throne. We have a tape teaching dealing with this, about the altar of Zeus and so forth. Now, the capstones of that thing were taken to Berlin, and then Hitler came to power. It's all kinds of things associated with Pergamum. I've been there a number of times where Satan's throne is. Pergamum was the gateway for the mystery religions of Babylon to get into Greco-Roman civilization. Peter, writing from Rome, where the Pantheon was, says, "She who is in Babylon greets you." It is not a coincidence that the European Union was established with the Treaty of Rome. It is not a coincidence that the central headquarters of the ecumenical and interfaith movement is in Rome and the Vatican. That's not a coincidence. The way I've explained it is like this. I'm from New York, and in New York, the first stock exchange was located on Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. But today, the stock exchange is located around the corner. The entrance is on Broad Street. Yet it's still referred to as Wall Street. Some of the building is actually on Wall Street, but the address and the entrance is on Broad Street. I used to live in Midtown Manhattan near Times Square. The original Broadway theaters, the American equivalent of the West End, were almost all on Broadway. Now most of them are on the side streets between Broadway and 8th Avenue, but you still refer to the American theater industry in New York as Broadway, even though only 1 or 2 theaters are left on Broadway itself. They moved. In Britain, there was an alleyway still existing between Whitehall and Thames Embankment, 1 block from Big Ben, from the Houses of Parliament. This alleyway separated 2 buildings, only an alleyway. The name of the alleyway was Scotland Yard, as in Inspector Lestrade in the mythical days, or the days of the mythical Sherlock Holmes. Scotland Yard long ago outgrew those premises. They built a new building on Victoria Street by the Home Office about a half mile away, and have expanded and relocated other things since. Yet it's still called Scotland Yard. The name of the original location of something stays with it, irrespective of its geographical location. It doesn't matter where you move it to, it takes the name of the original place where it comes from. Just like Wall Street, just like Broadway, just like Scotland Yard if you live in Britain. There is no doubt that there's a prophetic significance to the Vatican and to Rome as the founding place of the European Union, then called the Common Market. No doubt. But the ultimate platform of Antichrist, the ultimate home and center of false religion that he wants, is when he will enter the beautiful land and set up the abomination of desolations in Jerusalem. Great city. Yes, it's Rome. Yes, it's Babylon. Yes, it's Pergamum. All that's true. Ultimately, Satan wants to take God's place. Where the Most High is worshipped, Satan wants to be there. With the image of the beast, it'll be set up. And again, when I've looked at some things that Marco showed today, they have these very chips that women invented in Israel and in India. And women are putting this chip on their fingernail and painting nail polish over it so it's invisible. It shows if you are COVID vaccinated. It gives you your Visa card, your American Express card, your bank account, your passport number. I'm not saying that's it, but we know where it's headed, don't we? We know where it's headed. There is reason to believe, because of things that Klaus and others have said, and he's a terrible man, that he's an awful man. Klaus Schwab, he's an awful man. He admitted COVID is being exploited to be used to bring about the Great Reset. He said that directly. You can watch him saying it on YouTube. Quotes him verbatim. And they were talking about a global pandemic months before it happened. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. I'm just stating facts. Now they are talking about what will happen if you have a close down of the internet or a global breakdown of electricity grids because of electromagnetic pulse weapons. And they're going to do a test game shortly. These things are happening faster and faster. They are gathering momentum. We know Satan is in control of it, and we know what he's doing and why he's doing it. I don't know how much longer we have. I'm not into date setting. I'm not saying that the Lord could not give us further periods of respite, but I am saying this is not something that has ever happened before in human history. Not in this way, nor on this level. If COVID ever lets us finish our film that we were in pre-production about, why is this time different? We're going to make a film about it, Lord willing. We had to stop production because of COVID. But believe me, the Daniel Project was only the cartoon before the movie. Let's watch this now. In Joel, this army comes down. Matthew, there it is. Revelation. But now let's look again at Zechariah. Verse 4 of chapter 14. And that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will be split down the middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half the mountains will move towards the north and the other half towards the south. And you will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee as you fled before the earthquake and the days of Uzziah. It makes historical references. What happened in the days of Uzziah prefigure what's going to happen at the end of the age. I again just mentioned that briefly in passing. Then you see the living waters coming out. It's what happens in the book of Ezekiel, the second half of Ezekiel with the millennium. Okay. These things, while having global ramifications, will literally come to battle in Jerusalem. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle the city. Oh yes, Zechariah does make mention of Megiddo. He absolutely does say that. But that is not where it ends. That is where the armies assemble. Where does it end? It ends in Jerusalem. It ends in that valley. That's where it ends. The feet of Jesus will stand on the Mount of Olives. The last major earthquake was in 1927, but there is a fissure, an actual fissure under the earth, under the earth at the Mount of Olives, and it caused an earthquake that badly damaged, in fact, almost destroyed the Mosque of Omar in 1927. The waters flowing out, this is what Ezekiel predicts. Zechariah 14 exactly matches Ezekiel. So this happens. These armies come to Jerusalem, and there is some kind of an escape from Jerusalem for these people who look upon Christ. They flee. Most people agree to Petra, fulfilling the prophecies about Sila and Bosra in Ezekiel 16. It will literally happen there. This thing will take place in Jerusalem. Now notice something. After the Lord comes, they look upon him. Is the rapture secret? Is there a secret rapture? Yes, it is secret in that nobody knows the day or the hour. We know the signs, it's getting closer, but we don't know the day or the hour. Yes, the rapture is a secret. When it happens, will it remain a secret? No, it will not. People are going to know. Now, so many people are going to be dead by this time. Some estimate that only 1/10 of the Gentile population will survive. That's a guesstimate. It's not proven, but there are those who've tried to assess it mathematically from various perspectives, and some say it's only 10%. After all these things happen with the meteors hitting the earth and all these things. But we know only 1/3 of the Jews will survive. Only a third. 1/3. Well, they will look upon him where they are pierced. Antichrist will try to exterminate them. One way to understand this is again Hitler, when he knew he was going to lose the war, when the Americans and British crossed the Rhine and the Russians crossed the Oder, he knew the war was over. He knew he couldn't win. But he had the gas chambers going 24/7. He was trying to kill as many Jews as he could before he was destroyed in his bunker. Hitler is one of the most important historical types of the Antichrist. I'm not saying he's a type in the sense that Judas is, or that backslidden Solomon is, or that Nebuchadnezzar with his images. I'm not saying he's that kind of a type. He's a historical type. But the increase in anti-Semitism and Jew hatred we see happening even today, even in places like the United States, certainly France, certainly Britain. Despite the Holocaust, the lessons of history have not been learned. And Jews in desperation are returning to Israel. They fled Russia, they're fleeing France, and Aliyah has increased even from America now. Certainly Canada. It is in response to anti-Semitism. This growth of anti-Semitism is one of the things paving the way for the final onslaught of Antichrist. Remember, enmity between you and the woman, your seed and her seed. It's the proverbial heads and tails of the coin. Persecution of the faithful church and persecution of the Jews are two aspects of the same thing. Trying to destroy the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, genetically and anthropologically, and trying to destroy the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by faith. That is, those who are descendants by birth and those who are descendants by second birth. Now think of the edge of a coin. If you're a believing Jew, you've got two prices on your head. He hates you for two reasons. He hates you because you're a saved Christian, and he hates you particularly because you're a Jew who believes in your Messiah. He's going to go nuts, but this increase you see, the increase in hatred in the media and in social media of Christians, and websites being shut down and things, this parallels the growing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. All of this will reach its climax. Zechariah speaks of it. Revelation speaks of it. The Olivet Discourse speaks of it. But it mostly has its genesis, not the book of Genesis, but its origin, in the book of Joel. The book of Joel. So the ultimate fulfillment of this thing must in fact be the day of the Lord. Any other fulfillment, Nebuchadnezzar, Gog, Magog, or anything else, can only foreshadow, typify what's going to happen with the day of the Lord, which has not taken place yet. Again, beware of the lunatic false teaching of the radical preterists who say this all happened in 70 AD. That is complete nonsense, as we've discussed various times and shown the reasons. Now let's look. They come down to the valley of Jehoshaphat in chapter 3. Then it begins talking about the nations and what will happen after this. Moreover, what are you to me, in verse 4, O Tyre, Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Well, today, Tyre and Sidon is southern Lebanon. Who's there? Is it a coincidence that it's Iranian-controlled Hezbollah? But then, the regions of Philistia. What's Philistia? The Gaza Strip. Who controls that? Hamas, which in turn is animated by Iran. Is that a coincidence? Are these things a coincidence? I don't think so. I don't say that that's it, but I do say it's certainly morphing into it. What you see now is morphing into this scenario. But if you do recompense me swiftly and speedily, I'll return your recompense on your head. You've taken my silver, gold, bought my precious treasures to your temples. Again, this is historical references to the looting by Babylon of the first temple and the Romans of the second. And sold the sons of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks in order to remove them far from their territory. This reverts back now to speaking of the events of 70 AD. The time frame shifts. I'm going to arouse them from the place you've sold them and return your recompense on your head. I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the sons of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabians, to a distant nation, for the Lord has spoken. Arab believers in Jesus will have their blood avenged by Christ. But an avalanche of divine judgment is coming against Arab Islam. It is doomed to slaughter. It is something that God raises up in its arrogance, the way he did with Pharaoh, in order to destroy it. We are, of course, not speaking about Arab believers who are persecuted. Similarly, the Lord will allow the powers of hell to exterminate 2/3 of the Jews because of the curse of the law in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, because of their rejection of their Messiah. In other words, salvation was to come through the seed of Abraham, Jesus. Salvation was from the seed of Abraham. The scriptures would come from the people descendant from Abraham. You would think, as I've said a number of times in the past, that the two kinds of people who would be the first to embrace the gospel would be the descendants of Abraham, Jews and Arabs. Instead, Jews and Arabs have historically been the most antagonistic to the gospel. The rabbis hating Jewish believers, persecuting them when they could. Sometimes they still do in Israel. And of course, Islam persecuting Arab believers. We have a old Moriel teaching, Jewish-Arab reconciliation in Christ. We explore this subject in depth. I would point you to it. I'm only going through it insofar as it relates to the prophecies of Joel. Proclaim this among the nations, prepare a war, rouse the mighty men, let the soldiers draw near, let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a mighty man. Hasten and come, all of you, surrounding nations. Gather yourselves there. Bring down, O Lord, thy mighty ones. Let the nations be aroused. Come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There's Jehoshaphat again. Now, in Hebrew, no matter what direction you approach Jerusalem from, most of you know, or at least some of you, you say up. It's because of the Psalms of Ascent. Let's go up to Zion. Let's go up to Zion. Let's go up to Zion. I rejoiced when they said to me, let us go up to the house of the Lord. You're always going up. In Hebrew, la'alot. Think of the Israeli airline, El Al, means same thing. It doesn't matter what direction you approach Jerusalem from, north, south, east, west, it's always said you're going up. Okay. To the mountain of the Lord. Now, when Isaiah comes and gives his prophecy, Isaiah said, you will beat your swords into pruning hooks and things like that. You'll make these weapons of war into instruments of agriculture. But now, it's war. When Christ reigns, it'll be peace. Hasten and come, you surrounding nations, bring them. Bring them to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. And that has a particular reference, although not an exclusive one, to Arab Islam that surround. Let the nations be aroused. Come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There it is. Now look at verse 13. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. What harvest is that? We read it already. Look at Revelation once again, chapter 14. And another angel came in verse 17 out of the temple which is in heaven, also held the sharp sickle. And another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar and called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because the grapes are ripe. These are the grapes of wrath. And the angel swung the sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of God, of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, where the valley is, and it came up out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. Now, by the way, among Arab warriors and in China, you still have large mounted cavalry brigades, not divisions, but brigades. And of course, we had people who speculate that these things could be figures of or descriptions of something mechanical. That's all speculative. But let's look. multitudes of multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. There it is again. The sun and moon grow dark. The earth, the stars lose their brightness. Keep saying the same thing. The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The heavens and the earth tremble. But even then, the Lord is a refuge for his people and a stronghold to the sons of Israel. Then you will know I am the Lord your God, Ani Elohecha, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. So Jerusalem will be holy, and strangers will pass through it no more. And it will come about, now this idea of strangers passing through no more relates to the prophecy of Revelation 11 and Daniel, until it'll be trampled under the feet of the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles is completed, okay? Jerusalem, the holy mountain, is still defiled as long as the Mosque of Omar and the Mosque of Aqsa are there. The Dome of the Rock, they're still defiled. And under the Antichrist, false peace, they'll be given for that period indicated in Revelation 11 of half of the 7 years. But it won't happen anymore. These aliens, these non-believers won't be there. It'll come about on that day, the mountains will drip with sweet wine. The hills will flow with milk. The brooks of Judah will flow with water. And a spring will go forth from the house of the Lord to the valley of Shittim. Just like Ezekiel. Just like Ezekiel's description of the millennium. Egypt will become a waste. Edom will become a desolate wilderness. That is southern Jordan. Because of the violence done to the sons of Israel, in whose land they've shed innocent blood. These Islamic terrorists, they're always calling for martyrs and for jihad. They are shedding innocent blood. Now, God allows it. He has a controversy with the Jews because of their rejection of the Messiah and their breaking of the Torah. But these people, Islam, with the jihad and the mentality, they shed innocent blood. The last day will not come, according to the Quran. You know what it says? Until the tree cries out, there's a Jew hiding in back of me. Come and kill him. This is the religion of peace, as George Bush called it. But Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem for all generations. I will avenge their blood, which I have not avenged, for the Lord dwells in Zion. The Lord is going to avenge the blood of the Christian martyrs. We see this in Revelation 6. The martyrs call out, "How long, O Lord? How long? Before you avenge our blood." The Lord will avenge the blood of the Christian martyrs. Then he will avenge the blood of the Jews. That's what Joel said is going to happen. When we look at these prophecies in Joel, in light of the New Testament, the Olivet Discourse in Revelation, when we look at these prophecies in the book of Joel in light of Zechariah, and then look at Zechariah's prophecies in light of the New Testament, the picture becomes clearer and clearer. Certainly, Revelation 14 and Revelation 16 become clearer and clearer. And they're going to become clearer still. So in Joel, We have partial fulfillments. Nebuchadnezzar's armies. Allusions to 70 AD. Possibly a Gog and Magog scenario from Ezekiel, apart from the one at the end of the millennium. However, we must also note something else. This final battle, the Jerusalem that will be established forever, is of course the Jerusalem above. There will be a millennial reign of Christ. Coming out of this chaos. That's the end. But right now, we're at the beginning of the end. The end is coming. But right now, I have no doubt we have entered the beginning of the end. No, I don't speculate about dates, but I do look at events. I do look at what's predicted, and I look at the fact that books like Zechariah and Revelation and Joel are becoming clearer and clearer and clearer. The Holy Spirit is showing the faithful church what these things are, what is happening, and what is going to happen, and what to do about it. Well, what are we going to do about it? We are told in Joel twice what to do about it. Blow a trumpet in Zion. Yes, we warn unbelieving Israel. And we also warn an increasingly apostate church. Thank you so much for listening. We will continue with our Bible study series next week. We will begin with a new book next week. I'm still waiting to hear from the Lord what that book is going to be. But we've done 1 John, we've done Zephaniah, we've done Colossians, we've done Joel, and we're going to see what the Lord has for us to do next. If you have any thoughts or suggestions of a book, and it can't be too big of a one, because if you do Isaiah, we're going to be at it for 6 months or more. A short book, one of the 12 minor prophets or one of the epistles, something like that. If you have something you'd like to suggest, please send us an email and let us know. I don't believe I have to sit around and wait for the Lord to show me personally. I believe he can speak through the body. Leadership and things like that have their function, but the body is a ministering organ in itself, and we're happy to listen to what other people suggest, as long as you seek the Lord about it before you send it to us. So we'll need to know pretty much by the end of the weekend or the beginning of next week what the subject is going to be. Sandy will need to know, and we'll need to post it. But may the Lord guide us and direct us as to what book to study next. Thank you so much for listening.